Hi, this is Janet Fitch, and if it is noon on Wednesday, it means it is Writing Wednesday, where I answer your writing questions, craft questions, psychological questions, metaphysical questions. Uh, just about everything goes into the hopper because when you're a writer, it all comes together in one package, which is you. So this is my contribution to reality here, and welcome to Writing Wednesday. Um, I have questions from uh, listeners, and if you have questions for me today, write them in the chat, and we can um, have a conversation about them. And if you have questions for me in between Writing Wednesdays, um, write to me through my website, janetfitchwrites.com, and I can do a Writing Wednesday around your question. Hi, Amy. Nice to see you. Welcome to Writing Wednesday, everybody. Um, Hi, Wendy. Good to see you. Um, so, my first question, hi, Buzenna. Hi, Meredith. I'm sorry, I keep saying Diamond Dove. Hi, Meredith. Hi, Buzenna. Good to see everybody. Um, so, here's the question for today, which is a fabulous question from Jacqueline. Um, have you ever been in a consistent flow state while working on a book and then suddenly feel like something is blocking you from continuing to write? Well, this is such an interesting question. I don't know if anybody else has had the experience of being in a flow state. Hi, Linda. Um, Flow state is what we all are trying for, is that sense of the disappearance of the self, and then something is using you as an instrument of creation. Flow, there's a book called Flow by Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi. It's a very long Hungarian name. I believe he's Hungarian. Um, that examined the flow state that artists and other people who become absorbed in their work. You're absorbed in what you do, your ego kind of drops away, your thinking about what you're doing drops away, and we kind of become focused outside of yourself in a way, and concentrate entirely on what is in front of you, what is at hand. And in art, that is where like great art is produced. But great art is also produced by the sweat of one's brow. And this is the thing that I have the opposite feeling about flow than Jacqueline was proposing. She was saying, have you ever been in a consistent flow state and then feel something is blocking you from continuing to write? Now, my experience, and this is like a visceral experience memory of my own, at times of flow and not flow, is flow is not as common as all that. There's work where you sit there with your skills and you ponder and you try things out and you ponder and you try things out, and it goes well for a while, and then there's another blockage, and you overcome that obstacle, and then there's another obstacle, and you overcome that obstacle, and it's very labor. When you talk about process orientation, this is the process. Um, is that generally speaking, in art, you are just working with the skills you have. And then every once in a while, you click into something. I always think of it, the angels sing. It's when the angels sing. You've been working and working and doing your workmanlike job of what you know, your skills, your craft, you know, just like anybody else working at a skill, an upholsterer covering a couch, and you have good skills and you're covering that couch really well, but you might suddenly have an insight. Um, it's hard to get good uh, a good metaphor from couches, but perhaps you're inspired to do a ruching along a roll of cloth that you hadn't thought of doing before, and you get super absorbed into it. In fiction writing or in poetry or in art, these moments of sublimity are not the norm. Hi, Sarah. Good to see you. They're not the norm. The norm is hard work, just plain what you know and working off your craft. Flow is, for me, it's when the the work itself takes off. It takes, and then I disappear entirely, and it's just the work unfolding. And I say that's when the angels sing. So for me, a flow state is not a consistent flow state, and then you feel like something is blocking you. From my point of view, you're working with the skills, you're as smart as you can be, you're working with your skills, and then something happens and it's like the souffle rises, or um, all those elements and ingredients that you've been putting into that work suddenly come to life. Um, I can tell you where the angels sang in every single book I've written, and it's always in the midst of something else, and I just hear something. Something beautiful starts to flow out of me. And if I can just, all I have to do is ride that wave, and then you just ride it until it's exhausted. Um, this is where you don't want to be interrupted. Uh, I often find this state when I'm working at night and everything is very quiet and nothing is going to disturb me. Um, but it's not always like a middle of the night thing, but it's definitely where skills begin to cook, and you're cooking and you feel that you're cooking. It's such a subjective experience that my metaphors all have to be very uh, sensual rather than instructive. But I can't um, recommend it more. We're always listening for the muse. We're always hoping for the muse to smile upon us. But to expect that that's going to last, that it's going to be a consistent flow state, I say take the opposite direction and think consistent work habits. And that occasionally the wave, you hit the wave just right, and it picks you up, but it's not a consistent thing. And when it goes, as it will, it's not permanent. My old writing teacher, Kate Braverman, used to say, "There's no such thing as a permanent state of grace," and it is a state of grace, that flow state. Um, on the other hand, we can encourage the flow state. Um, and one of it the is focus, and focus is very it's in I wouldn't say endangered state, endangered state, but our focus is being sideswiped and grabbed at every turn. And, so there's some basic things you can do to focus better. You can, certainly put on a program. I have an application called Self Control. And self control, you make a list of places you're going to block for a certain number of, for a certain amount of time. And I usually find like 2 hours is enough, uh, because I'm most in danger of it at the beginning of anything. It's hard to begin things. So if I put on self control, and on self control are my social media sites, there's a game site that I really like, a lot of memory games, and I like to do, memorize the 100 biggest cities in China, things like that. Um, so it's very tempting because work is hard, writing is hard, and we're all going to admit that here. Writing is hard. It's a lot of controlling anxiety. Um, it's a lot of having higher expectations of yourself than you generally might, that make you overly critical of what you're doing. So it's always a dance with your own perfectionism. It's always a dance with your own anxiety. It's always wanting to do really good work and then being hypercritical of what you actually produce. Um, and then, so cutting off the sources of fooling around. Um, Very important. And just starting. Sometimes the biggest obstacle is just getting started. Just getting yourself settled down in the chair and getting going. Once you're tootling along, I don't know that that's really, a flow state like we're really hoping for, where, the universe chooses you as a vehicle of some beauty coming through you. Um, that doesn't happen all that often, but a nice chugging along, workmanlike uh, workday is what we're looking for. And so being able to turn off the most common distractions, if you can turn them off for, say, give yourself 2 hours, 3 hours without that, often you can go for longer. So we have some comments here. Leslie says, speaking of angels, just got through the birth scenes in Chimes. Oh, the second of the two Russian novels, the Russian Revolution. So there's a birth scene in Chimes, and some of the most incredible, intense prose I've read in a long time. Thank you. Wondering what it felt like to write it. Yeah, that's the angels, definitely. That was one of the places in writing that book that the angels sang. Was the It's kind of a hallucinatory scene. And so I really had to get myself out of the way and let that hallucinatory world come forward. And just uh, often a scene like that, it's very intense, but it has a lot of possibility to have that beauty, that otherworldly thing where the universe speaks through you. More than a scene of, say, waiting for the bread line, or that kind of thing. So, yeah, how did it feel to write those scenes? You're pulling things that you remember, you're pulling disparate things that things you've experienced. There's a birth scene of my, you know, kind of upper class girl who's become not a Bolshevik, but what we would call a fellow traveler, a supporter of the cause. And she's lost just about everything for her beliefs, and has developed this whole second life for herself. And due to circumstances, ends up in a remote village near the Urals, uh, to have her baby with very religious people, which she is not. And the whole thing has an overlay of mythology. I read a lot about, uh, well, I mean, writing that book was just research, super research intensive, but definitely read a lot about um, uh, mythology, Russian mythology, peasant beliefs, superstitions, religion, um, to write, especially those sections of the book. And it takes place in a bathhouse, and the bathhouse is its own locus of magic. I have a book like this called Midnight at the Bathhouse, mythology and what mythology and superstition in Russia. I mean, like this. Um, so lots of things come into play in the birth scene. And it became quite rapturous. I mean, definitely that was written in flow. Um, Amy says her weakness is perusing fabulous Airbnbs in Europe. Yeah, we all have our thing that it's to control anxiety. We feel that tension building up, and it's so much easier to go and do something that you know how to do, and it's easy, and it doesn't require any no risk, no reward, just completely putting yourself on hold to go and list the 100 biggest cities in China in 15 minutes or whatever it is, 10 minutes. So fabulous Airbnbs in Europe. And then Meredith says, how do you keep the inner critic and the mind's planning of the story from interfering with the act of actually telling the story? Now that's really interesting. How do you keep the inner critic and the planning of the story from interfering with the act of telling the story? It's a dance. It's not, there's no rigid border between those two. It's a dance. You know what the scene has to be. So the inner critic and the planning of the story are also two different things. The inner critic sees what you're writing and goes, oh, that's not very good, or that's not very interesting, or Um, and you can't be listening to that while you're trying to create something. So there's a dance with that voice that maybe I'll stop and get a better verb, or find a metaphor, something to juice it up a little bit, to calm that inner critic. The planning of the story, the architect, you can call it, there's a critic and then there's an architect. Okay, so the architect is going, yeah, this is great, but how does this attach to what just came, and how is this going to take us into the next? What changes? Where's the change? And you have to, I mean, that's your, call that the architect, call your like your little assistant. As you're up there, creating and creating, and you got a little assistant with a clipboard going, yeah, but this still has to propel us to, when into the next scene, and how is it going to justify itself? Where's the change? So it's a little reminder voice. I wouldn't get rid of that person. You know, that person doesn't stop you from writing. It's just reminding you that you're also supposed to be building something here, as well as spinning out and making these beautiful objects. Um, and if that interferes with the act of actually telling the story, um, the inner critic interferes. The inner critic does interfere, and you have to, um, say, this is as good as I can get it right now. and I'll have to come back to it. And sometimes you make a note in the, even you can make a note right on the page in capital letters, come back to this, not sure, seems bland, whatever the inner critic might be saying. And then continue, don't let him stop you. Whereas that little storyteller guy, um, I think it's a dance with that. You have to tell a story that people are going to be interested in, but you also have to create something in the moment that is interesting right now to the reader reading it right now. So it sometimes they'll say, yeah, but what does this have to do with anything? And maybe you'll say, I don't know yet. Let me see. Let me just finish the scene and see where we're at. Maybe you have to finish the draft and see where you're at. But it's harder to get rid of something once it's really knit into the fabric of the book or the story. So if you have your little assistant is going, how does this fit in? Then you're starting to develop a little idea. Well, I think that, you know, that I needed this as a subplot. I need um, this represents another side of this person's life. And you know, people are not, cardboard cutouts. They have different parts of their life. And one of the things about a novel is that its characters are three-dimensional. They don't just, in genre fiction, they have a problem and they just keep hitting the problem, following the problem, following the problem. But in fiction, literary fiction, the character has more than one side to them. They're more than just this one problem. They also have things they like, things they don't like. They, have sexual interests, or they have artistic interests, or they have a problem in a different direction. And that's what keeps us believing this is a real person, and more than just somebody to carry the story along. The little assistant would be happy with that, but the artist, you, the magician, is not happy with that. So, so here is um, Meredith says, I think maybe my inner architect is a little grumpy to my little assistant. Your inner architect is your little assistant. So they're a bit grumpy that you're not spending enough time constructing the experience of moving through your book. That you're excited about the things you're handling right now, but that little assistant, the little architect, is going, yeah, but how's this going to fit into the building? And you have to pay attention to that. It's one of the things that people who are poets, who become fiction writers, have trouble with that piece. So value that little assistant, but don't let them drive the car. Wendy asks, sorry, off topic, is it possible to have two points of view in one novel, then end with a third person point of view? I'm considering a first person for one character and a third for when they meet. Two points of view, two first person points of view, and then end with a third. If you are telling a story from a first person point of view, I would hesitate to switch in midships or towards the end. You kind of, in fiction, you build a doorway, and then you walk through the doorway you built. If you are planning to move between first and third, you needed to set that up. it sounds like it's a sticky thing. I think you're feeling it too, that you're not quite sure about that. One in first, one in close third, and then omniscient. I mean, it seems like you start out really close and then you have something less close and then you end distant. And it seems like the wrong direction, to end by pulling back into omniscient. If you're going to do, yeah, too hard on the reader. If you're going to do omniscient, why not start with omniscient? If you're going to do one in first, one in close third, I don't know. Even that is kind of a lot, but I could see that. But why omniscient? It's like you don't know who your protagonist is. It seems to me it's like I don't know who my protagonist is, so I'm going to just go for omniscient. It seems like by then you should know who your protagonist is and then stay with them and end in their point of view rather than discarding the whole thing and doing omniscient. You can do a an omniscient like coda, but I would, if you're going to do that, I would consider doing an omniscient opener so that the reader is aware that that is a move that you might make. Okay, well, let's go on to another flow question, seeing we have flow today. I am trying to write a book, but every time I sit to write, I get overwhelmed and cannot continue. Has this happened to you? What did you do to avoid this sensation? So this is not a write. I have a lot of writer's block uh, um, talks, writing Wednesdays. They're in the archives, but this is not really a writer's block problem. This is a writer's problem that we all have a problem sitting our butts in the chair and starting to work. So, what this person needs to be aware of is everybody feels that kind of anxiety when they sit down to write. It's like, I don't think I can do this. This is hard. I could be doing the Sudoku, which isn't so hard. I could be, I'm hungry. Everybody has this as they sit down to work. And the difference between people who become writers and people who don't become writers is our ability to one of the things is our ability to tolerate that unpleasant feeling of every time I sit down to write, I get overwhelmed and cannot continue. Um, what can you do to avoid the situation? Well, you cannot avoid it. You cannot avoid. Well, there are a couple of things to do. One of which is, was it Dickens? Was it somebody? Twain, Mark Twain, said he always stopped in the middle of a scene when he was going to stop for the day. He stopped in the middle of a scene so that he knew where he was going to pick up and he didn't have to start from nothing. So that would be a very helpful thing for you, is to stop before the scene is done so that you can sit down in the morning and pick up where you left off. Another thing that is helpful that I do, and I do it all the time, I've been writing a long time, is I rewrite what I wrote the day before to start out. So I don't try to start from zero and just plunge in and write something new. I generally start by rewriting what I wrote the day before. It gets my tone back. It gets me back into the book without a cold start. It's like a little warm up. And so everything I write has been gone over and over again, because every morning I start by rewriting what I wrote the day. And it's not rewriting, it's just reading it, putting in, like, tightening something, putting in some better language, getting a metaphor. Um, and then you can move on without being in that horrible place where you're just looking at the screen or the page and just going, I don't have an idea in my head. I can't do this. I'm overwhelmed. Another thing that makes people overwhelmed, like, what did you do to avoid the situation? One of the things you can do when you're overwhelmed is to remember, nobody writes a novel. Nobody writes a novel. We only write a scene. So sometimes we get overwhelmed because it seems like I'm never going to be able. Oh my God, I wrote these two Russian Revolution novels, historicals, and it took me 12 years to write both volumes. And I remember, being there in like year 8 going, I'm building a Gothic cathedral all by myself. This is never going to end. I'm going to die, and this will still be in progress. And blah, that kind of thing is really bad. Try not to look at the whole project. Try just to look at what's under your hands, at the scene that you're in, and just really kind of put blinders on and just look at what you're supposed to be doing today. Um, and that will help with the overwhelm. Take deep breaths. It's a mild panic attack is what's being described here. And if anybody, has ever had this, anybody ever have this mild panic attack when you sit down to write, like every day? Every day, you're not any different than somebody who's been writing for 4 years, and might have 8 novels, uh, that little, like, I can't do this, I cannot pull the rabbit out of the hat today. Don't. Just go back a little bit, rewrite what you wrote yesterday, see if you can carry it forward a little bit. Look at the scene that you're in. How can I make it more realistic? How can I make it breathe more? How can I make it a little bit more vivid? Um, that's my advice. And then let's see. I just heard myself thinking, yeah. Okay, and just know there's part of it. So sometimes just knowing that there's nothing wrong. There's nothing you did wrong to have this overwhelm. It's nothing unfamiliar to anybody who does this. So last question is, do you ever have, Amy says, I try to see my novel projects as a quilt and do one square at a time. Yes, knowing I'll stitch them together later. Yes. That was something that was suggested to me when I was working on White Oleander, is I just couldn't figure out how to do it. And Kate Braverman, my teacher, said, just write a scene and put it in a box. Write another scene, put it in a box, and keep doing it until the box is full. And then take a 3-ring binder, put holes in it, and then figure out what kind of order the scenes will come in and what you still need, and just put a piece of paper saying something here. And then you can see what just doesn't fit anywhere. And so that gets left out. And it certainly kept me from being overwhelmed. it's a hard, the only thing about that method is that there's a lot of waste. There's a lot of wasted time. The little architect is going to like be bugging you. It's like, how does this fit in? How does this fit in? I don't know. And then when you do your notebook, you might find a lot of stuff that just won't fit any, just doesn't fit in the story. Um, but it helped me. It definitely helped me write that book. Um, uh, so that's the quilt. That's the granny square approach. And I'll tell you, it does work when you just have no idea. Um, because she thought that anything you wrote in an 18-month period fit together some for some it'll fit together somehow because you have the things that you're interested in, your perspective, and it'll all come out of that. So she was very optimistic about that. Um, and here's the last question I have for today. Do you ever have trouble starting a new book because you haven't gotten over the last one you finished? Anybody have that experience? Um, yeah, definitely, definitely, definitely. And there are, just like relationships, like all relationships, you have a big, huge freaking relationship, marriage, 10 years, 20 years, and it's over. You're not going to just pop up like nothing happened and start a new marriage. It just like, and then if you try, and maybe some of you have had this experience, I certainly have, that you finish a big project, it feels so odd not to be working on a big project, that you start something just to be working. And it might not be something that really is going to be worth the next 3 years, 4 years, 5 years of your life. Um, it is the rebound novel, just like marriage. People have a rebound relationship right after they break up with someone, with somebody like totally wrong for them. But they're so used to being in a relationship that they just have to be in a relationship. I gotta find somebody, and they do, and it doesn't always work out well. Surprisingly enough, those rebound relationships are called that for a reason. You're not ready, and so it's better. It's good to date after you've broken up a relationship. It's good to date, which is the fictional, what you could think of a short story as dating. It's a good time to write short fiction after you've finished a book. um, a good time to you use that nervous energy, do exercises, write short stories, write poems, write a play, do some other shorter forms, and then wait until a big, if the big project is coming, wait until it comes to you. Don't just grab anything, you know, because not all projects are equal, are created equal, and you got to find the one that you is going to be worth your investment of time, energy, labor. Um, really think it through. Um, Trouble starting a new book because you haven't gotten over the last one you finished. And then even when you're ready, even when you have the right, when you found the right book for you, the right project for you, um, you will find that you don't necessarily, we like to think that we learn and we get further along the line, we get better and better and better, But the thing about writing is you have to create new tools for every book that you write. That what worked on the last book doesn't necessarily work on the new book. Hi, Zunaid. Good to see you. It doesn't necessarily work on the new book, and usually it doesn't. You have to create everything new when you start a new book. So you really have to be ready for that. You have to be ready and rested um, to start that new book. And writing, listening, trying out things to see what the voice of the book, of that book is. You know, don't just pull out the voice of the last book because it's so familiar to you, because the voice of this book might be extremely different. Um, Bozena says, just finished reading Han Kang's The White Book. Keep thinking about your teachings. No material wasted, all about white things around us. Oh, I got to write that down. That sounds really interesting. The White Book. By Han Kang. Oh, that sounds wonderful. Yeah, you might end up doing something completely new with a new book. And if you drag your old habits or your old forms or your old voice into it, you're not going to make a book that lives so well on its own. There's a writer that I really, really like, but they have a kind of a hang up of threes. There's always threes, three sections of a book, each first person, I believe. Um, there's a lot of triangles in their book, love triangles. Um, and I'll tell you, reading their like fifth book or fourth or fifth or sixth book, and just, oh, there's the love triangle again, there's the this, there's the that. They're beautiful books on their own if you hadn't read the other ones. But the more you read of this work, the more you become impatient with it's not a gimmick, but it's a repetition that I find loses the more you know, the less interesting it is. And it should be the more you know, the more interesting it is. Resonance from other books. So if you see people kind of quoting themselves, that's somebody who hasn't ever really cleared out of the last book. Um, so any questions about this or comments about flow and how to urge, how to keep the flow going? Or the experience of when the angels sing. So Zunaid says, I've just read The History of Sound by Ben Shattuck, a collection of short stories. I read the title short, and does it live up to its reputation? So the White Book, and now we have The History of Sound. The History of Sound. Wow. Well, I'm reading something right now that I just love, which is a couple things I'm reading. One is something called My Friends. It's a somewhat political novel by a Libyan um, writer named Hisham Matar, Matar. Uh, and it's somehow really speaking to me in this moment. Um, And I'm reading Creation Lake by Rachel Kushner. Actually, I'm listening to it. I got out of the library, and um, this is prose that I just love. If you want to see what I think is great prose, read any Rachel Kushner. The first one's kind of a conventional book, but it is also beautifully written. But this last one, Creation Lake, and listening to her read it out loud, it's worth reading out loud. And we all want to create prose that is worth reading out loud. Um, and we do that by reading it out loud to ourselves and maybe reading poetry before we write so that we have that music in our heads. She has a very crunchy prose. There's a lot of corners to the words. Um, and it's very precise writing. And I just think she is so good. So I'm listening to that in the car, and I don't even mind having to drive somewhere. Um, we live in LA, so to have to go somewhere 45 minutes or an hour, it's like, oh, but I can listen to a book. So, anybody else have anything they're recommending? Or experiences of flow and the little architect friend. That guy is a really good friend. Don't just completely shove him out of the room. Um, all right. Well, I thank you for joining me for Writing Wednesday. And please, if you have questions, I love questions. I do much better with a good question. So write to me at my on my website, janetfitchwrites.com, and send me your questions, and I'll do something for you next week. In the meantime, hope you write well, and uh, yeah, and stay stable and active. Okay. Thank you. Bye.